Welcome to the next series of videos. This video is going to look at key topic 1 of paper 2, which is the superpower relations and the Cold War, and this is looking at the early development of the Cold War from 1941 to 1958. We start off with a bit of context. The end of the Second World War. In May of 1945, Nazi Germany have been defeated, and the main reason for that defeat is fighting a war on two fronts. Fighting the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front and fighting the British and the United States on the Western Front. Essentially, this impact is going to be huge because a new map of Europe is going to be drawn up post the Second World War and post the Nazi occupation of many large parts of Europe as well. But what we see is the most unlikeliest of allies in the USA and the Soviet Union joined together to defeat Nazi Germany. We're going to talk more on the next slide about how that relationship was forged as well. This is really going to set the scene really for a new world order. This is going to see the end of Britain's superpower status, and we're going to see the rise of the Soviet Union and more so the United States post Second World War as well. So our course starts really based on three meetings, three conferences between the three most powerful people in the world at the time, essentially. And we'll see that this is where Britain starts to lose its superpower status. And the first conference where this relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States and Great Britain, the Grand Alliance as it becomes known as, or the Big Three, starts at Tehran in late 1943. At this stage, the USA and the Soviets were not allies, but they were both fighting Nazi Germany. So they both found common cause in defeating Nazi Germany. So it's in Tehran, in what is now modern-day Iran, and we had Roosevelt, the United States President, Joseph Stalin, and Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister at the moment. The Roosevelt and Stalin shared a particularly warm relationship, which we would see at the Yalta Conference until his death, and this is where we start to see Britain and Churchill being pushed out as well. Essentially, at Tehran, it's agreed that the US and Britain and British would invade Western Europe, and they would start up a second front. For the last 2 years, the Soviets had been fighting the Nazis. Many of you who looked at Year 9 will know with the Stalin course that the Nazis had invaded massive swathes of the Soviet Union, but they'd managed to start to push them back. So Stalin really pushes for that, and they agree for that. It's also agreed that the USSR would declare war on Japan once Germany were defeated, and that was really key, only when Germany were defeated. They all decided as well that Germany had to be forced into an unconditional surrender, remain weak, so there was no attempts or chance for a third world war to break out. So they wanted to remedy the mistakes made after the Versailles Treaty, where many felt that they weren't harsh enough. Interestingly, the Soviets were allowed to keep any Polish land that they had actually illegally stolen in 1939, and we know that Poland will become under the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union. So 2 years later, they meet, or just under 2 years, in February 1945, they meet at Yalta, which is in modern-day Ukraine. The changing face of the war had changed massively. The war was inevitably going to end in defeat for the Nazis. So Yalta was really significant in a case of, well, what happens next? We are going to win the war. They were still wary of the threat of Hitler and the Nazis, but by this stage, defeat seemed inevitable. Again, it's the same people who meet. It's Roosevelt, it's Stalin, and it's Churchill. And this is where they agree that Germany is going to be divided into 4 zones. The 3 zones given to the 3 powers at Yalta, but also the French as well, who had been defeated in 1940 as well. They do talk about Berlin being divided into 4, but it's at the next conference at Potsdam that that's finally formulated. They did all agree that Eastern Europe would be a Soviet sphere of influence, though, but the West, so the British and the Americans, were pushing for these free elections. Stalin agrees, but as we know, this was simply lip service. He had no intention of actually sticking by this. They also all agreed to join the United Nations to ensure peace post the Second World War, which again is quite ironic considering what we know happens between the two superpowers. The final conference is in June of 1945, so this is a month after the surrender of Nazi Germany. The war is still going on with Japan. That would end in August with the dropping of the atomic bombs, and we'll talk about the significance of that. But we see a huge shift in personnel here. So in the middle figure, as you can see, is Harry S. Truman, the newly elected US president due to the death of Roosevelt. Now, as I said before, Roosevelt and Stalin shared a common interests. Roosevelt feared the British Empire more than he did the Soviet Union and communism. He felt that the Second World War and the end of it was a time to end the colonial empires. So that's why he pushes the British out. But Truman is very much aligned with the British, and he's very anti-communist and very public about it as well. So this is where we start to see the rift develop between the US and the Soviet Union. This unlikeliest of allies due to ideological differences, communism, capitalism, democracy, dictatorship, was only held together through this idea of defeating Nazi Germany. The Nazis have been defeated, so now we start to see it unravel. Clement Attlee as well, halfway through the conference, he was the newly elected Labour Prime Minister, as Churchill had been voted out. So Churchill was no longer Prime Minister, but he still remained a significant figure, and he gives his Iron Curtain speech the year later. Truman, interestingly, postpones the conference in order for him to test the atomic bomb, and that's through the Manhattan Project in New Mexico. And once they've tested that atomic bomb, he then comes to the conference and he reveals this to Stalin as well. So purposely done to show the Soviets that the US were starting to develop nuclear arsenals that could destroy cities, and that's exactly what's going to happen at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. The Soviets had obviously essentially liberated all of Eastern Europe. They had conquered Berlin. They had defeated Hitler, essentially, but they had not removed their military presence, and they argued that this was simply defensive. They'd taken over Poland. They'd purposely let an uprising in Warsaw take place, and then against the Nazis, and then only once that uprising was defeated, the Soviets come in. The Nazis essentially destroy the whole city of Warsaw, and this is what we see in Eastern Europe: war-torn cities destroyed, and then the Soviets move in. Conditions rife for communism. This is where they finalized that plan to split Germany and Berlin into four. Germany was going to pay reparations, and that was going to come in the form of industry. The Soviets were going to be sent the heavy industry from west, the Ruhr is the industrial region, and they would send food, mainly the kind of main industry in East Germany. They would send that to the west as well. Stalin began to refuse to submit to the pressure of free elections, so we start to see him showing his true colours really here as well. 1946 is what I call the year of tension. So the alliance is already breaking apart, and now it really does. So in March 1946, Winston Churchill gives his Iron Curtain speech. He's egged on by Truman after a heavy night of drinking on a train with some stiff whiskies, and they agreed to make this speech. And the speech is significant because it's the first time a politician, and a significant politician like Churchill, openly states that there is a divide between East and West, and that's what he means by the Iron Curtain. You can see here by the political cartoon, it's a metaphor really, and the fact that the Soviets have descended, and darkness has descended over Eastern Europe. We then see later in 1946, we see the long Novikov telegrams, which exacerbate the tension even further. George Kennan, the US ambassador in Moscow, he writes a telegram to Truman stating that the USSR are a rival. There's no realistic option of coexistence between the two. It's called the long telegram because of its length. In response, in September, Novikov, the Soviet ambassador in Washington, sends a telegram back to Stalin, and he says that the US, he suggests that the US are aiming for world dominance, that they're increasing their military. They haven't disbanded their peacetime army, so both sides are increasing the size of their armies and arms as well. So this massively increased the distrust and tension that was already there, and this exacerbated it, made it worse even further. We know that Stalin promised free elections, and there are elections across Eastern Europe, but these are essentially rigged. They had not demobilized. The Soviets had a military presence in a lot of these countries as well, which I think would have had an impact in the voting side of things. The Baltic states are not even on this map, so Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, they were not even given the option of any sort of elections. They were essentially just annexed by the Soviet Union and would be until 1991. As I said earlier, in Poland, they allowed Warsaw, the capital, to be destroyed, and then the Soviets move in, making it right for communism. And in 1947, we see Polish free elections. We see that in Romania and Bulgaria as well. And the result of these elections are communist victories as well. So we know that these were rigged and they're used through intimidation too. Hungary, which becomes significant in 1946, had some normal democratic elections in 1945. Some of the communists were voted in, but in 1947 they're voted through electoral intimidation, vote intimidation as well. By 1949, Hungary is essentially a one-party communist state. Czechoslovakia is probably one of the most significant in the fact that they had been democratic before the Second World War. They were invaded and conquered by the Nazis. So this is a key area for Stalin, as it bordered West Germany, as it bordered Austria, it bordered the West. Czechoslovakia was a key buffer for him and the Eastern Bloc. So what he did was that he enabled a coup, so a military coup and a violent coup, to make sure that communism was inserted into Czechoslovakia as well in 1948. This is where we see then Truman, who, as we know, was anti-communist and was very vocal about that. And the year prior to this, we saw the Iron Curtain speech. We now see Truman, the US president, seen as the leader of the free world, seen as the person who is going to fight, oppression and dictatorship. He publicly announces the Truman Doctrine. It had been triggered by the fact that in Greece, the British were trying to prevent a communist takeover. They were trying to support the royalists, so the monarchy in Greece. They were related to the British royal family and Prince Philip. But the British at this time, as I said, they're becoming a failing world power, and the hangover of the Second World War cannot retain it. Truman provides financial aid to the Greek government, and they're able to defeat the communists. So that's an initial immediate consequence of this doctrine. So for the first time, we see the US involving itself in European politics. And Truman announces that he will fight communism around the world. He will stop the spread of communism. It's mainly going to come through financial aid. And we see that through the Marshall Plan. And we'll talk about that in a sec. But what we talk about this is it's a policy of what's called containment, trying to contain the spread of communism going into the West, which is why very quickly the Western powers decide West Germany cannot be weak, for communism will spread like wildfire. So they start to put billions and billions of dollars of investment into West Germany, making it this extremely strong capitalist state. And let's not forget that in the middle of the Soviet zone, we have Berlin. And West Berlin is this capitalist safe haven with prosperity. So the Marshall Plan is agreed to provide billions of dollars of aid to Europe in order to rebuild after the Second World War. It is very much out of US self-interest, and a phrase that's often used here is called dollar imperialism. So it's the fact that the US were using economic means to increase their influence in Europe as well and to stop the spread of communism. By 1953, 5 years or so after its induction, $17 billion had been aided to Europe, and you can see from the map the different countries that were provided aid. The Soviet reaction is strong. These, again, are direct consequences of the Truman Doctrine. So Cominform on the left there is set up, the Communist Information Bureau. This was designed to coordinate all communist parties in the Eastern Bloc and the satellite states. They would follow the Soviet foreign policy. They would look to Moscow for direction. And a lot of the communist policies, like economic policies, collectivization, where the economy is run by the government, is introduced into these as well. So it's coordinating, something that the Nazis did as well in that course. The other reaction is Comecon, so the Council for Mutual Assistance. And again, RAS, the Marshall Plan, provided aid, Comecon takes it away, and it just made the Soviets into an economic powerhouse. So it removed a lot of the wealth from the satellite states, heavy industry from East Germany and Czechoslovakia as well in particular. Now, all these events leading, so the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the introduction of Cominform and Comecon, all lead to the first major crisis of the Cold War, which is the Berlin Blockade. So Marshall Aid had been ratified and agreed, and then the Western powers also decided to introduce a brand new currency into West Germany called the Deutschmark. And Stalin saw this as the final straw, really. He saw that he was purposely being undermined, that the West were trying to make Berlin and West Berlin and West Germany stronger in a direct response to communism. So he felt attacked. So he blockades Berlin. Obviously, it's in the Soviet zone. You can see some of the imagery here. So we can see the Russian bear, as the bear is always shown as Russia, the Soviet Union, and he's enclosed Berlin. He cuts off, on the 24th of June 1948, cuts off all routes to Berlin, and it lasts 10 months, this blockade. We know that the US response is strong as well. They are unwilling to give up on Berlin, and this is the Truman Doctrine in action. And what we see is the airlift. They flew along air corridors, landing at 90-second intervals. And what Truman then decided to do as well was to station B-29 bombers. So these were planes that could carry atomic bombs. He stationed them in Britain. So now the Soviets were actually within bombing range of atomic bombs as well. So again, the exacerbation of the tension. By September of 1948, 4,600 tons of supplies had been dropped per day. And this peaked in April of 1949. The 16th and 17th of April, there were 1,398 flights just in 24 hours, and they dropped 13,000 tons of supplies. Food, medicine, clothes, anything that they needed. In total, 275,000 flights took place, on an average of 4,000 tons per day as well. This showed the US were unwilling to let communism win, and on the 12th of May 1949, Stalin called off the blockade. So the first major crisis of the Cold War, where war seemed possible, was a victory for the West against communism as well. But the big consequence of the Berlin blockade is it then leads to this arms race. Already said that the development of the atomic bomb was starting, the B-29 bombers. We now see, and the fact that the Soviets and the US had retained their wartime armies, we now see a huge increase. And we see that Europe is not now divided economically and ideologically, it's also divided militarily. So we see the development of NATO, and NATO is a direct consequence of the Berlin blockade. The countries of the West felt they needed military protection. This is where we see the development of NATO. So the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949. We know the Soviets will respond a few years later with the Warsaw Pact in 1955, but what we see here is through NATO and the Warsaw Pact is we see a huge development of the arms race. This figure here, figure 3.2, just shows you some of the main developments of the arms race. So that's in billions of spending. So you can see in 1949, they're spending around 13.5, 13.4 billion. By 1951, the US has doubled more so than what they were spending in 1949 as well. And that just goes on to increase with the United States as well. We see the Soviets test the first atomic bomb in 1949, 4 years after the US had used it. But then finally in 1953, we see the first testing of the hydrogen bomb. The US tested theirs, and then a few months later, the Tsar bomber, the largest ever hydrogen bomb, was tested. And from this diagram here, you can see the size of those bombs. There's Mount Everest. Here's the impact of the Tsar bomber, and you can see the Hiroshima bomb. That killed 100,000 people in one blast. Look at the kind of devastation that the Tsar bomber could use, and this was only going to increase with nuclear technology as it developed as well. So this proved the Soviets weren't lagging behind in the United States. They would do later, but not at this stage as well. Churchill called this whole global situation of the arms race a balance of terror, and it really, truly was a scary time. It then gets even bigger. So in 1957, the Soviets create the first ever satellite which could actually orbit the Earth, and whilst in 1 hour 30 as well, and it was called Sputnik. Now, while Sputnik didn't possess any weapons, it showed that the arms race was now going to space, and the Soviets had sent the first satellite. They would go on in 1961 to send the first man into space, and obviously the Americans would land the first people on the moon in 1969. So we're going to see, the introduction of a whole new theatre of war potentially. Eisenhower responds quite strongly. He increases military spending on missiles by 20% from 1957 to 59. The USA found NASA in order to kind of develop the space race, as they were worried the Soviets were winning. And he increased the number of B-52s as well. And lastly, in response to the Berlin crisis, they placed missile bases in West Germany. The final part of key topic 1 is in Hungary, which is obviously just looking mainly at the Soviets' relationship with satellite states, in particular Hungary as well. So it's key to note in 1953, Stalin dies of natural causes, and his successor is Nikita Khrushchev. And Khrushchev very quickly distances himself from Stalin's policies, from the purges. He publicly denounces it. And what we see is a process called de-Stalinization. So you can see here on the bottom left, this is a huge statue of Stalin, and it was toppled in Budapest in Hungary, in the capital of Hungary as well. So Khrushchev he made it clear that he was open to a peaceful coexistence, but obviously he wanted to retain power and influence within Eastern Europe as well. His counterpart was the newly elected President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower had fought during the Second World War. He'd been the leader of the Allied forces in Europe, of the West, of the British and the Americans, and he was very acutely aware of the threat of nuclear weapons, and he was very open to easing tensions as well. So rather than Stalin and Truman, who were exacerbating the tensions, these two individuals see a chance to kind of to de-escalate and diffuse it as well. But in Hungary, the de-Stalinization and a new leader meant that people in Hungary who did not want communism in the first place, as we said, they had elections in 1945, thought that the time was rife for an uprising, or a revolution as they would call it in Hungary. They would not call it an uprising. They were quite anti-communist. The wealth had been sucked out of Hungary because of things like Comecon. They were extremely patriotic, and they wanted a change as well. So these riots that take place lead to them thinking that there could be change as well. The Prime Minister, on the 24th of October, the new Prime Minister of Hungary, Imre Nagy, asks Khrushchev to remove the Soviet troops, and they agree. So at first, Khrushchev agrees to remove Soviet troops from Budapest and from Hungary. But the next few days, Nagy and the government, the new government, democratic government, started to introduce a series of reforms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Many leaders of the Catholic Church were released from prison. And then probably the thing that meant that this whole revolution fails is that he announces that they're going to leave the Warsaw Pact, which had been created a year before. Now, a few days later, we see a complete U-turn from Khrushchev. At dawn on the 4th of November, 1,000 Soviet tanks roll into Budapest. They capture key buildings. The Hungarian army are defeated. The last help on the Hungarian radio is help, help, help. 4,000 Hungarians are killed during the response, and Nagy is arrested. He will end up being killed. He's sent to the Soviet Union, and instead Khrushchev puts in János Kadar, a hardline Soviet who will listen to Moscow and will not toe the line as well. So the sad thing about the Hungarian Revolution or uprising is that they believed that the US would support them because of the Truman Doctrine. But Eisenhower is not interested in supporting Hungary, and what we see is a condemnation of the Soviet response, but we don't really see any real strong response as well. Some of the NATO members, in particular Austria, took in Hungarian refugees, 200,000, but there was absolutely no military support provided as well. They were too concerned with obviously the nuclear threat and the arms race as well. So that's the end of key topic 1. So we see that the Grand Alliance were held together through a common interest in defeating Nazi Germany. Once Nazi Germany were defeated, these ideological allies or ideologically different allies soon start to dissolve. We see an exacerbation in tension, in mistrust. We see the USA attempting to stop the spread of communism. We see Stalin responding by tightening his grip on Eastern Europe. We see the financial aid, which triggers the Berlin blockade, and then a exacerbation of the arms race and the beginning of the nuclear age as well. The Soviet position in Eastern Europe is shored up because of the response, and that's the kind of response we will see particularly throughout the rest of the course, is a violent response as well. Hopefully you found the video helpful and useful. Tune in next time for key topic 2, which is the Cold War crises from 1958 through to 1970. Thank you.